Jordan and Gretzky, Serena and Ruth. Remembering great ones is easy to do.
But what about the no-names who spent their whole lives long snapping footballs and catching sack flies? They're guys, remember that guy. Remember that guy, remember that guy, remember that guy, remember that guy.
They're just gonna remember some guys now.
Look at this! You're kidding me! Is Michaels trying to beat Bret Hart with a sharpshooter? Yes, he is! Are you Remember That Guy? The show where we mine our memories for nuggets of nostalgia about peripheral players, past and present. Hey there, folks! It's me, one of your hosts, James. I won't be repeating that French. I am not actually in Montreal, but there are people that are actually here with me.
I'm thrilled to be here, Diaz, with you once again. And we're actually here with the third person in the ring that night. We know about Bret Hart. We know about HBK. But there was the third man in the ring, and he's our very special guest. Please introduce yourself.
That's right. You know, somehow I was there. You didn't see me. I was hiding behind a ladder, but I got a great visual of what was going on. But we have an even more special guest today. I'd like to introduce the Instigator, Abraham Josephine Riesman. Welcome.
Oh, it's so good to be here. I've been looking forward to this.
We have been looking forward to having you on, also known as Josie Riesman. It is a pleasure to have you here. You are the author of many just essays, True Believer and Ringmaster, some profiles on, I think it's safe to say, two of the biggest figures in popular entertainment culture nowadays in Stan Lee and Vince McMahon, respectively. And of course, with the latter there are some unfortunate forays into the importance in political culture and also the importance in sporting culture. I guess before we go any further, I'd love to start beyond that byline CV resume. Do you have any other sporting background, whether it's fandom or participating that you think?
Let me put it this way. I was on a T-ball team and they made me the scorekeeper. I really did not excel at sports. I did not have the makings of a varsity athlete. I had a lot of childhood obesity going on in grade school. In junior high, I had my only real brush with sports, which was I was the third best cross-country runner on the 8th grade cross-country team. I have never competed in a sport subsequent to that, or before that. The actual peak of my athletic ability came when I was a freshman in high school. I had a gym class where it was a huge public high school. So gym class was this free-for-all where they just sort of sort you randomly into sporting topics, events, whatever you call them, to have to do that in your gym class for the next quarter. So I got randomly assigned into wrestling, not of the amateur variety, the collegiate variety. And I was already a huge fan of professional wrestling, but I'd never actually learned any of the moves or holds. And although, of course, collegiate wrestling is not the same, it was similar enough that I really loved it. However, I have found to my great chagrin throughout my life, whenever I've been I need to work out more, I should find a gym where I can do collegiate style wrestling. There just isn't that. You can't just hang out and do wrestling, which I feel is a real deficiency of modern culture, because for about the entirety of human civilization, you've been able to go find some guys hang out and wrestle casually, and you just can't do that anymore, you know?
This is the one return thing where I think they might have a point. Early 20th century and late 19th century athletic clubs, that and the fat men's clubs. We need to bring back those two specific social gatherings.
I don't see any problem with that. If you this is the magic of wrestling. If you have a way to get your frustrations and your emotions out through combat that isn't actually combat, what a beautiful thing, you know?
I can only think about Foxcatcher, though, because we've talked about it on this podcast. The idea that to get a really good wrestling gym, you need a weird billionaire who might end up killing someone to sponsor it.
I will say, after working with Penn Athletics, Josh Harris made a very generous donation to the Penn wrestling program, the owner of the Sixers. So, and now Penn is back in the national rankings again for the first time in a long time.
So you need a weird billionaire.
You need a weird billionaire. I know. I don't have that kind of
We're
cash
billionaires.
yet. I'm weird, but I'm not at the billionaire. You know, I really do think I could become the trans JK Rowling of nonfiction, you know? Make that kind of cash, get a castle somewhere.
And how much would she love that? I mean,
oh, wouldn't she love that if
particular.
people just started referring to anybody as the trans JK Rowling? Oh God, she'd put a hit out on me. It'd be terrible. Anyway, there isn't that much money in authorship, is the joke for anyone who's listening. I feel like I should specify that because in the age of AI, you get all these weirdos who are like, these authors have been sitting too pretty for too long. We need to take them
Like,
down a peg. And I'm
authors
like,
do you know?
I'm like, A, how many authors do you know? And B, I am an author. I really don't make much money on these books. Like, I'm just gonna warn everybody. It's not sustainable that way, but I love doing them. So, you know, that's a whole other story, I suppose.
You have to be Neil Gaiman and get everything put on Netflix.
Right.
Or
Well, I didn't want to get too much into the nitty gritty, but that is kind of the only way you can make it sustainable is by optioning it for things, optioning your material for things, which can often feel very gross, but it's sort of the only game in town. I mean, no publisher, unless you're Stephen King or J.K. Rowling or one of like 3 other people on this planet, you just can't get that kind of cash. I haven't earned back either of my advances, you know, and that's standard. I had a New York Times bestseller in Ringmaster, but I don't know why I'm complaining so much. I just thought maybe you'd like that little window into whatever.
Well, I enjoyed that window. That like window into your writing is, if I may try and segue to something, the whole reason that like I follow you on social media, which is part of how we connected and made this happen. And that is in particular because of a thread that you put out a little bit ago. And the general sense of it was trying to sum up your writing. And the quote that I pull is, in this supposed age of disillusionment, what do people have faith in? And you were talking about, in particular, you know, 2 of the things that you've written about, these hegemonic Marvel entertainment creations and then wrestling, and both of which are owned and run by kind of gross in different ways organizations. But while sports wasn't listed there, that was one of the first things that like kind of came into my mind with the question that you then later posed about like that the faith you put into these things is worth questioning if it's worth having. And I think that's kind of the same thing in sports. We talk here a lot about just the general ickiness of all of that.
Yep.
I guess.
Yeah. You have to, this is the trouble. The magic factory, magic it's Soylent Green. The magic of entertainment is made of people. Like, that's the trouble. Is
there a way, do you think, for there to be any innocence in it? Is there a way to have any ethical fandom under capitalism? Or like, is every single thing that we like just doomed to have these guys forever?
I don't know. I really have been struggling with this lately. And by lately, I mean in the past decade or so of tumult that the entertainment and just world have gone through. And what I keep coming back to is this idea that the magic that is created by art, or by sports for that matter, or sports style art like wrestling, it's not that you have to separate the art and the artist and go art good, artist bad. You have to make sure that you see those interconnections. But I feel like it's just impossible to live your life if you only consume content, for lack of a better term, that was made under totally ethical conditions. I learned this when I was a young kid because I was an anti-sweatshop activist. And I remember learning about sweatshop-made apparel and thinking, well, this is awful. I'll just go buy the apparel that isn't made in sweatshops. And I was like, oh, right. There kind of isn't that. Like, there was American Apparel for a while, but Lord knows that company had its ethical stains. No pun intended. And it was just like, you can't totally win. You know, you can't just find a place. So it's not so much that there's no ethical fandom under capitalism. It's more that you have to be a pirate. Like, you have to be a poacher. You have to be on your guard and prepared to break the rules a little bit in your fandom. Like, what I can't stand is toady-ish fandom. That's what's really bad. And you see that with Marvel fandom a lot, especially Marvel Cinematic Universe fandom, although that fandom is waning greatly lately. The diehards who are still there and who've been there the whole time will really reject any attempt to sort of question the details of how this stuff was made. And not only that, they will sort of just assume that whatever's canon is the best and most important thing. Like these stories really happened. Like we're just going to find the truth of what Batman really did in this story. And it's like, well, it's made up. I mean, I get where you're coming from. I'm not saying, none of this matters. But what I really love is the other approach to fandom, which is the fanfic approach. As the great Professor Henry Jenkins would put it, textual poaching, where you're taking texts that exist, that are copyrighted, that are very often run by gigantic corporations and not even owned by the people who created them. And you take those creations and under the magic of fair use or transformative work, you run with them. And you don't make money off of it. The company certainly doesn't make money off of it. And it's totally not kosher. I mean, that's the wonderful thing about fan fiction is you can take stuff, run with it. Now, I don't know how you can do that with sports exactly. I'm trying to figure that out because even in wrestling, there's still that patina of I like the character, I like this story, and not necessarily the person. But with sports, I mean, please educate me because I don't really know how to approach that from that perspective.
At the risk of like tooting our own horn, I would say that like the idea of sitting around and talking about, I mean, like every single baseball game, we're back in baseball season. So I'm back into like the daily intake of it. And you get the daily reminders that any reproduction or recording or accounts of this game without the express written consent of MLB, like we just hear that every day. That does technically mean we can't talk about what happened.
That's fascinating. I didn't know accounts was in that list as well.
Yeah. Like you were, and who's going to enforce that?
But right, who's going to enforce that? But it's a power move. I mean, it's just, it's keeping the threat there just in case they want to use it. Wow.
And so there's, us gathering, but also just people gathering at a bar and like talking about the season as they watch a game going on in the background. Like the fact that every instance you see on a television screen while you are watching sport has so many things that you can talk about, not about what's immediately going on, I think is kind of how we reclaim that. And that is advantageous because most of the time there isn't sports going on. Like even baseball, the vast majority of the time, baseball is not happening.
Yeah. Interesting.
Right.
Go ahead. I want to hear more about this.
Right. Well, I mean, and from the perspective of fanfic, like I feel like even if it's not necessarily something that's being produced and then distributed, like the idea in my head that one day the 76ers might win the championship and Joel Embiid might actually stay healthy and it can happen. Like that's the only reason you keep coming back. That's not based on any sort of reality. I have no evidence that points towards that.
Embiid is only healthy on AO3. AO3 is the only place where you get 82 games
but
of it.
I kind of love that. Sort of the idea of the winning season as this sort of utopian story you tell yourself in order to push forward. Maybe that's not what you're saying, but I really like that.
It's 100% what I'm saying. I have brought myself to tears at least 3 times in the past year, just thinking of, that sweet moment when the Sixers are down 2 and there's 1 second left and the ball's in the air and Joel Embiid has just made a 3 to win it. Like, I'm going to start crying right now. But like, that's my fanfic.
See, that's beautiful. I don't, the trouble is obviously that like the utility system that provides you with the core part of that magic is a corrupt utility system. I mean, it's major sports, the major sports leagues. And that's the trouble with wrestling and with comics as well. You can never fully clean your conscience. You can never fully live a pure life of, well, I don't touch anything that's unethically made. And I don't think that that's a reason for despair. I think in many ways you have to kind of be like what you're talking about. Like you have to sort of aspire to a world where ethical labor wins, even though that you have no evidence that you're going to get to that. But it's a worthwhile thing to believe in.
Right. And I ignore the fact that the jerseys are made by Fanatics and Michael Rubin's going to make $1 billion while he does it. But like, you just focusing on that one thing.
He doesn't make any money off your dreams. He makes no money off your dreams, Diaz.
Right.
No, that's exactly right.
Well, and kind of like within that context, it's great that we're having you on for this conversation now, because we are gathering the day after WrestleMania. In the ring, one of the most important WrestleManias of all time. You have the conclusion of Cody Rhodes' story. Outside the ring, you have all of Vince McMahon's chickens coming home to roost, and somehow WWE as a company is able to put on a WrestleMania that kind of makes us forget about that stuff. I'm just curious, your approach to viewing, taking in content from WrestleMania this weekend, and how it fits into kind of the larger thing of what's going on.
I found it fascinating. I mean, God, where do I begin? You know, for me, the two things that really stood out, well, three things. One, minorly, Logan Paul, I remain grudgingly very admiring of.
You do have to hand it to him a little.
You really, I hate saying that you got to hand it to him, but he's an excellent wrestler and a fantastically charismatic heel. And the fact that you hate to give it to him is part of why he works as a heel. It's like, it's a total mind fuck, and you're like, God damn it, he got me. But
I say the same for his brother. They both just have a fucking way. They know their industry and they know how to do it.
Yes. Anyway, that's a minor point. The slightly more major point was, God, Rhea Ripley and Becky Lynch are just so good. Rhea Ripley especially. I really, they'd never do it because obvious reasons, but they really need to have intergender matches in wrestling in WWE more often. And let me tell you, you watch WrestleMania both nights. I know people blew up for Cody winning, finishing the story, but like that was in many ways a gimmick match. Like you had a lot of famous names popping up to get extra pops. Rhea and Becky, it was just the two of them, and Rhea was more over than just about anybody. People cannot get enough of that woman. And what I keep saying is, like, if they knew what was good for them, they would have Rhea Ripley beat Cody Rhodes and become the new champion. Like, you have no idea how many, at least I'm a trans woman, and I can tell you every trans girl in existence will squeal their hearts out to see Cody Rhodes in a submission hold being applied by Rhea Ripley. Like, it's too good an image, but they'll never do it. I'm glad to see Rhea Ripley succeeding, but you have to talk about the main event, right? Like, that's sort of the main part of this year's WrestleMania. And I will admit, I was a little disappointed because I believe that Roman Reigns' title reign was like, I don't know how much you guys, I was a theater kid growing up, so I don't know how much you know about Commedia dell'arte, but there's this principle in Commedia dell'arte called the Lazzi, which is this comedic trope where you take some joke, you tell it once, and the audience laughs. Second time, laugh a little more. Third time, hilarious. Fourth time, okay, why are we still doing this? Sixth time, it's awful. 30th time, it's the funniest joke anyone has ever heard in their entire lives. That was Roman Reigns' title reign to me. At first, I was like, oh, that's cool. He's you know, and like he's going heel, he's doing all this interesting stuff. And then after a while, you're like, this is getting boring. And then it kept going. It just kept going. And you're like, oh, I get it. Like the joke made sense to me finally. And it makes sense why he had to lose at this WrestleMania, because Vince's era is over. But he was the avatar of the gangster capitalism that Vince so deeply believes in and has perpetuated. He was the avatar of inevitability, that like you can't really beat corruption. Corruption never goes away. You can only sort of keep it at bay. And I kind of loved this idea that as long as Vince was in charge in some capacity, this mobster character who doesn't care about anybody, sort of cares about family, but not even really that much, this character is unbeatable. You just can't do anything about him. So I'm a little sad to see that title reign end, but it's really interesting to see how far they took it, and to also see how, I mean, I guess the real thing I should be talking about is the Paul Levesque era. This whole new thing that we're all part of, whether we like it or not. You know, we'll be talking a little bit more about the Hall of Fame ceremony in a moment, but it really was remarkable, starting with the Hall of Fame ceremony and then both nights of Mania. how hard they were hitting the message of the past doesn't exist. We are now in a new era, and that era we owe to our dear leader, Paul Levesque. Like, it was so weird. You had all of these people saluting the dear leader, Paul Levesque, who we're not even calling Triple H anymore, astoundingly. And now
Is that a thing? I didn't know. I'm not super into the. I did not know that he's not Triple H anymore.
On the first night, he came out to his old Triple H entrance still, but he was introduced as Paul Triple H Levesque. Whereas then, the Rock was just the Rock. He wasn't.
I thought Josie was just being formal.
Well, no. But then subsequently, Stephanie came out on night 2 and gave this surprise appearance where she said, she sort of made some pleasantries with the crowd, and then I can't remember the exact quote, but she goes, "We are in the dawn of a new era, and it is the Paul Levesque era." And that wasn't the first time that phrase had been said. It was first said at the Hall of Fame when you had Paul Heyman's acceptance speech, and he kept talking about the Paul Levesque era and Paul Levesque. And they kept saying Triple H's real name over and over again. And on top of that, they've been doing, at Mania, they were also just going on and on about saying fans instead of WWE Universe, the official nomenclature that Vince enforced. They just kept relishing it.
The I love pro wrestling, as opposed to, they've been saying sports entertainment
for decades.
And they're finally bringing back pro wrestling.
They're saying pro wrestling. I mean, I don't know how much you want me to segue into the guy that we're talking about, but it really is amazing to see in this past weekend, the first time there's ever been a WrestleMania that Vince McMahon was not in charge of. It's kind of insane. I mean, you see this real life Soviet Party Congress speech. It's Khrushchev after Stalin died.
I really
everyone going
that analogy earlier.
Right.
Today.
That's the only thing I could think of when I was watching Paul Heyman's speech was I was like, oh, this is the secret speech. This is the speech that Khrushchev gives where he goes, okay, Stalin's dead. We can all acknowledge now that we really hated Stalin. I mean, the difference here is Khrushchev was the new dear leader, but it's almost as if somebody is talking about Khrushchev now and saying, okay, well, we have a new Supreme Premier, and this guy gets it, and he's not going to screw up, which I guess we'll see what happens. But it's a very strange time to be watching wrestling, an exciting time, and those two always go together. You never have an exciting time in wrestling that isn't weird. It doesn't happen. Think of the times when wrestling has been huge. Is it ever because it's wholesome? No. Even in the 80s, we now retroactively talk about how the 80s rock and wrestling connection era was wholesome. No way. I mean, it was more kid friendly, but it was gauche. It was strange. It was unprecedented.
I can't buy that anything from the 80s was more just
wholesome.
Generally relaxed and chill and wholesome. Yeah.
Weird.
The defining match is probably Hulk Hogan beating the dirty person that's not from here, the Iron Sheik.
Yep. Either that, or on the other side, you have Hogan and Piper, which was, rooted in initially the rivalry about misogyny. I mean, it was the WWE portraying itself as the virtuous, women's lib outlet. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that happens. But anyway, I feel like I'm getting off topic. I don't even remember what the question was now. Where am I?
Well, just I guess two things I wanted to say kind of about your perspective on WrestleMania, and then we can segue into the guy. I did also find it a little gratuitous, the Paul Levesque worship. The fact that Cody Rhodes, in his crowning moment, still calls down Paul Levesque. Like, Paul, I know you don't want to come down here, but come down here. That felt a little bit extra over the top. But to your point of Roman Reigns representing the Vince McMahon era, perhaps the death throes of it, the one thing I was saying to these guys before you hopped on was I found it very interesting that I do genuinely think the original angle was going to be Roman versus The Rock as the main event. Rock gets the belt. And that is perhaps one of the encouraging signs that this could be a slightly different era. Is in the Vince McMahon era, Vince would have said, shut the fuck up, you stupid little fans. You don't know what you actually want. I'm giving you this match and you're going to love it. Whereas in this Paul Levesque era, You hear the outcry.
Yeah.
You hear how unanimous the crowd is, how unanimous your fans are that no, Cody deserves this shot. This is his moment. And they actually go with it and they actually pay it off. And you get perhaps the greatest payoff in a WrestleMania main event of all time.
It's wild. It's wild. Things are changing. I don't know how much they're going to change, but even today you had the news that Vince has been, under whatever terms, I mean, it seems like it's pretty beneficial to both parties, but he's selling a huge chunk of his stock in TKO, which is, already a minority share. He doesn't have any kind of control like he used to, but they're cashing him out. Like, things are changing there. And I don't know what they're going to turn into. I mean, we haven't had a wrestling industry in North America, well, in US and Canada, I should say, that isn't shaped by Vince McMahon in 40 years. 40 years this guy was the prime mover. And I don't know what happens now.
Because it's also the only time that a single individual cast as much of a shadow. Like, not only was it this unprecedented tenure, but it was a tenure of unprecedented scope at the same time.
Absolutely. I mean, prior to Vince, the most powerful guy in wrestling at any given moment was the president of the National Wrestling Alliance, who was essentially the prisoner of this oligarchy, of this oligopoly, I should say, this cartel, the NWA. You had all these promoters who were very vicious and hated each other, but also needed each other. You had guys like Sam Muchnick, one of the only Jews to hold a prominent space in wrestling, who was the president of the NWA for many decades and left right around when things started to get a little haywire, when cable started to get introduced and then Vince takes control, all of that. The NWA was powerless to stop him because no one had ever tried it. I really think part of it was cable and the coming of mass media. There was going to be a disruption and Vince happened to be on the right side of it. But also there's a certain degree of, well, nobody had bothered to think that was possible. I mean, you don't have a whole lot of stories of wrestling promoters prior to Vince saying, well, I really dreamed of conquering the entirety of 2 countries. It just wasn't a dream that people had. And then Vince comes in, and because he didn't really have any restraints of shame or the law, because the law doesn't pay attention to wrestling, he just went for it. And he got very lucky in a lot of ways. I mean, I could go on and on. I wrote a whole book about this guy, but I don't want to bore you.
Much like his buddy Trump, it is the idea of someone would actually have to want to stop. And like you're saying, there just wasn't anyone that...
Well, no, it's not like Trump. You have to have somebody who wants to stop him who is also not encumbered by rivalry.
Yeah.
Because in both cases, you have a popular front on the other side that if they could have actually banded together, could have really accomplished something. Like, you have all these really skilled promoters who have a lot more experience as executives than Vince does, and they just can't stop infighting. First they're caught on their back foot because nobody was expecting somebody to do something like this, and then they just keep bickering with each other and can't make a united front. And meanwhile, Vince is rampaging. And then Vince just gets lucky a few times. I really think WrestleMania #1 may well not have gone over if not for the Saturday Night Live appearance that Hulk Hogan and Mr. T made, which was a last-minute fill-in because Steve Landesberg had a family commitment. And that was the night before WrestleMania. But Saturday Night Live was viewed by 30 million people at the time. So all of a sudden, you had 30 million people going, oh, there's a cool thing happening tomorrow night. Maybe I should go. I mean, it's just... history is weird that way.
Well, at the risk of giving away any more of your book, let's try and move away from Vince so there's still a reason for people to check your writing out later afterwards. Because
I don't want... Who wants the cow if you can get the book for free or whatever?
I think you provided an amazing trailer.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Our main event today, as I understand it, is a different guy. So we would love to clear out of the way.
Sure. I wanted to... Yeah, I wanted to talk about a guy who is known for picking guys. There are many people who prefer or at least enjoy calling themselves this person's name guy. So I figure, why not turn it around? why not talk about the guy behind all of those guys? And of course, I'm speaking about Paul Heyman, Heyman, the longtime wrestling factotum who is really the great survivor of modern wrestling. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today, is this through line of survival in the life of Paul Heyman. You know, I haven't done the research into Paul Heyman that I've done into Vince McMahon, so please don't take all of this as total authoritatively researched gospel. I'm going off of existing reports that I've consumed, and based on stuff that came up in my research about Vince that, you know, happened to relate to Paul. But I kind of wanted to talk about the myth of Paul right now, rather than necessarily the reality of Paul, because I'm assuming if you're talking about guys with a capital G, you want guys who feel like they're bigger than just a lowercase g, you know? And Paul Heyman is larger than life. He always has been. I first encountered Paul Heyman in my viewing life when I was a teenager. I had been watching WWF wrestling for a few months and had started hanging out with some wrestling heads at my junior high. And one of them just had parents who were a little more permissive even than our parents. And this kid watched ECW. He watched Extreme Championship Wrestling, the promotion that Paul Heyman was running at the time. So I went over and watched one night, or maybe I didn't even go over. I probably watched it in my parents' house on the upstairs TV. I caught ECW on TNN, the Nashville network. And it was unlike anything I'd ever seen. I'd been watching WWF wrestling, and this was like I'd been, you know, vaping CBD, and then I finally smoked weed. You know, it was like, oh, wow, this is all the cool parts of WWF wrestling turned up to 12. That was how Paul Heyman hooked you. He was and is a tremendously charismatic showman, but also he has an uncanny ability to get you hyped. I don't know what other phrase to use. Like, this is the magic of wrestling. The sizzle is always just as important, if not more so, than the steak. The sizzle is what it's all about in professional wrestling. And Paul Heyman is a longtime manager, promoter, booker, you know, writer for people who don't know how wrestling terms work. And I have come to be totally fascinated by him, especially after this past weekend. I'll give a little background on him, but this past weekend was this real tremendous moment in his life. He was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, and he gave this acceptance speech at the induction ceremony that was kind of a retrospective of his whole career. And I encourage people to watch it. It was a completely gripping speech. He's a really gifted public speaker. And I say this, of course, as a 2-time state champion in Illinois in impromptu and extemporaneous speaking. But he's a really gifted orator. And in this speech, he was basically given the task of denouncing Vince McMahon. He was the first person to accept an award that night. And his speech was basically out with the past, in with the future. I love professional wrestling, not sports entertainment. And I kept thinking, I don't know if you guys have read 1984, the George Orwell 1984, but I just kept thinking, oh, they're making the Jacob Goldstein of wrestling be the one who stands up and says, we're at war with East Asia, and we have always been at war with East Asia. Like, the idea is they get this guy who's like a very aggressively Jewish stereotype in his character. And I'm Jewish, so I really relate to that and find it fascinating. You have this guy who's constantly getting up there as an object of hatred and derision for the fans, Jewing it up at all times. And it makes you think of, in 1984, Jacob Goldstein, the probably fictional figure who is a traitor and had gone to the enemy in Oceania, and everyone's supposed to look at him and denounce him on screen. You see him and you go, boo, Jacob Goldstein, what an awful Jew, how dare he? And then at the same time, in Orwell's novel, the whole world can get flipped upside down in wrestling, and you're supposed to just accept it. You're always supposed to just take it and roll with it and go, okay, well, I guess this guy's good now, or this guy's bad now, whatever. And I found it really interesting that they had this. Sometimes, I'm not saying Paul Heyman himself is an anti-Semitic caricature, but the character he plays very often is this sort of sleazy Jew. And he doesn't downplay the Jewiness of it. I find that fascinating. I guess to take a step back, like I said, this is going to be a story about survival because Paul Heyman, he was the child of a survivor. Literally. His mother was a survivor of the Holocaust. She was a European Jew who had been in the Lodz ghetto and Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. She married Paul's father, who was a personal injury lawyer in the Bronx. And this old world Jew and new world Jew come together and they have this baby. And I can't help but think that being the child of a very intense Holocaust survivor was something that drove him to be a survivor. And lo and behold, I'll spoiler alert, he's still managed to survive in the wrestling industry throughout 40 of the most tumultuous years an industry has ever gone through. And he has not only survived, but thrived. He started out as a hustler, and he's still a hustler. When he started out as a hustler, he used his bar mitzvah money to buy a photo studio so he could take photos of wrestlers at Madison Square Garden and other venues for his little wrestling newsletter. And he used that ability to take photos, which was, a technology not everybody had access to. Not everybody had a dark room, but he used his bar mitzvah money to buy this studio. And then he could talk his way into taking photographs backstage and getting to know everybody.
So assuming that he had a bar mitzvah at a relatively usual age.
13-ish.
Just like,
yeah, he's a child.
13-year-old. Come on,
Yeah.
take pictures. Okay, cool. Just making sure the image in my head is correct.
You are getting it exactly right. And it's very interesting. This is around the same time that boys his age were getting molested in the Ring Boy program. It's sort of weird how easy it was to get close to these people and how dangerous it could be. But although the Ring Boys who were molested by people running that program, Heyman had his wits about him and didn't really get into other people's trouble. He just managed to make his own trouble and make it work for him. He was a photographer, newsletter. He starts hanging out. He becomes friends with Captain Lou Albano, Freddie Blassie, and the Grand Wizard of Wrestling, who are the three great heel managers of the mid 20th century, basically. These were guys who were very good, not necessarily at wrestling, but at talking up wrestlers, being threatening, making people hyped up, getting people to hate them. And Paul studied at their feet when he was a teenager. Then he talked his way into working with Dusty Rhodes, another great wrestler and promoter. He worked for Jim Crockett. He just kept hustling his way into all of these different places. And if you watch this documentary about him that came out in 2014, that's on Peacock, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Paul Heyman. It's really interesting. I don't know how much of it's true because I haven't done all the deep dive investigation on Paul Heyman's life, but he tells a great set of stories. And the stories are all about him lying and cheating his way into the inside. And so once he was inside, he starts really working in the wrestling industry. He becomes a manager. He's doing that in Florida, I believe. But he becomes this character based loosely on the fact that he looked like Michael Keaton's character, Johnny Dangerously, in the movie titled Johnny Dangerously. So he starts going by the name Paul E. Dangerously in the late 80s as a wrestling manager. And the bit becomes that he's just a kind of shitty Jewish guy. Like that's the subtext. You're not supposed to say the Jewish part. You're supposed to say, oh, he's a hustler. He's a yuppie. He's rich, manipulative, and he's scheming. And it's like all of these things that just add up to just say Jew. You're talking about a Jew, a Jewish stereotype, and I don't say that derisively on Paul's part. Wrestling is all about getting at the libidinal base urges and making them text, taking this subtext and making it text to a certain extent, or at least taking your suppressed urges and poking at them in a way that surprises the audience. And he made a good name for himself as a manager and a commentator. In there, he was also, I skipped over the part where he was the managing events and taking photos at Studio 54 and did his first wrestling event, which was an event where he gave an award to Ric Flair at Studio 54 and had the wrestling debut of Bam Bam Bigelow. Like, you can't make this up. That was his first wrestling show ever. He's a very lucky and smart guy, but he ends up managing and then doing commentary. And very long story short, he winds up in charge of this company called Eastern Championship Wrestling, which was down on its luck. You know, Vince has basically beaten everybody, so regional wrestling hardly exists anymore. But he takes this nearly defunct company and transforms Eastern Championship Wrestling into Extreme Championship Wrestling in the early to mid 90s. ECW, I really think it's troubling and problematic, doesn't even begin to describe it, but it's great American art. It's better American art in many ways than WWF programming of the same era. And even of the, WWF reaches its heights at the end of the 90s by emulating ECW. But seriously, you go back and watch the original mainline stuff from ECW in the mid 90s, it's genius. I mean, the only people doing anything like it were the Japanese promotions that did extreme wrestling, but hardly anybody in America saw those. And to translate it for an American market was a real accomplishment, but he pulled it off. I mean, ECW became this underground phenomenon. It was made on a shoestring budget and with a lot of shady handshake deals, according to people who participated. But you end up with this magnificent body of work where you had really boundary-pushing performance art in the form of ECW wrestling. You had Tommy Dreamer, Raven, Sabu, New Jack, like all of these people who were wrestlers known for extreme violence and for, faked violence that was nonetheless so painful that even though you knew it was being faked, you couldn't help but get emotionally involved with it. Like if you liked the Sandman and then you saw that he was bleeding profusely from most of his limbs and his forehead, you couldn't help get upset. You'd be like, well, I know that this is a predetermined match, but I know he's in pain.
Well, yeah. Sometimes faked violence, but I mean, I think what kind of set ECW apart too is like sometimes it was very real violence. Like,
yes,
you have the infamous incident where New Jack literally pulled out a knife and fucking stabbed his opponent because he didn't like the way that he hit him one time.
Yeah, there was always that threat that something real would happen. And that's the magic of wrestling in what I call the neo-kayfabe era. You don't just want to see a fantasy. You want to see a fantasy where at any minute reality might burst in. And, even before the Montreal Screwjob, you had ECW messing with the nature of reality and with people's conception of what was allowed in the art form of wrestling. They would just do stuff that was so outrageous, not just because it was violent, but because it would reveal insider secrets about wrestling. Like that was arguably the most appealing part for the old school or hardcore, at least, wrestling heads, was they would go, oh my God, they'd have like Steve Austin on before Steve Austin was famous. He became largely famous because he went on ECW after being at WCW and said mean things about WCW that you weren't supposed to say, and did essentially a shoot on Eric Bischoff, etc. And that really grabbed people. So Paul Heyman, not the only innovator at ECW by any means, but he was the person who put the team together. He was the visionary, and by a lot of accounts, he was not necessarily a visionary you could trust. I mean, Tommy Dreamer, one of his star wrestlers, has often talked about feeling utterly betrayed by Paul Heyman. When Paul Heyman, in 2001, facing bankruptcy, sold what remained of ECW to WWF. WWF had eaten ECW's lunch by emulating ECW and taking talent from ECW, but there was also some kind of collaboration between Vince and Paul Heyman that was totally secret at the time, but eventually you can see in historical record that there was some kind of relationship behind the scenes between Vince and Paul where they were negotiating about talent and kind of treating ECW as a farm league for WWF. Because they both hated Eric Bischoff and Ted Turner at WCW. So it was kind of a little alliance of convenience. But eventually, WWF does it at scale and with higher production values. So ECW suffers a lot. And when the sale happened, pretty much immediately after, you have all these ECW wrestlers appearing at WrestleMania X7, the 17th WrestleMania in 2001. And it was this huge event, like this is this invasion or like merging or whatever it is. And there was a lot of messing around with reality and what's going on, etc. But you have this amazing story that may well end up being like the opening anecdote of my sequel to Ringmaster. Although I have no lack of interesting stories that I could begin with. But Tommy Dreamer, the day of WrestleMania X7, according to Tommy Dreamer, this is only his testimony, but it's about his mind, so how could you really know one way or the other? He wanted to, literally, he was thinking about getting a gun, because they were in an open carry state, or maybe it was concealed carry, I don't know gun laws as well, but like you could bring a gun into the arena where X7 was happening. And Tommy Dreamer was like, I thought very, very seriously about buying a gun, walking into the ring, shooting Paul Heyman in the head, and then shooting myself in the head on live television. And it would make me the ultimate legend. I would have been a martyr for the business. Now, according to Tommy Dreamer, what stopped him from doing that, and he was feeling betrayed because this merger had happened. He'd turned down offers from WWF before. He'd said, I'm sticking with ECW. And then Paul sells the whole company to WWF. And Tommy wasn't booked to have a match that night. He was worried he was just going to get left behind. So he's planning to do this. According to Tommy Dreamer, his phone rings. He picks up. It's a number he doesn't know. And it's Jim Ross. And Jim Ross was like, hey, Tommy, we're working on it. We're going to have a match for you. Like, don't sweat it. And so Tommy stood down. But that story haunts me. I mean, it's such a weird, strange thing to think about. You think, oh, he's probably exaggerating. But you read the account, he keeps going into detail. And when you think about what had happened in wrestling in the previous, 4 years, it was not insane to think that somebody might kill themselves on television. We'd already seen somebody die on television in Owen Hart.
No, yeah, well, you had the Owen Hart thing, and
Brian Pillman. I mean, you had all this death that was happening. If Tommy Dreamer had committed suicide on live television, I think we would be shocked, but we'd be talking about it as part of a pattern.
Right. I mean, just to make it a little sillier, Jim Ross making that phone call, I'm just imagining the scene from Billy Madison where he calls back the kid he bullied. He's like, hey, look, you probably don't even remember, but I didn't mean anything. And it's like, oh, dude, I forgot about it. Don't even worry about it. And then just, oh, okay, won't kill myself or Paul Heyman.
Yep. Something like that. I mean, it was a wild time at the turn of the millennium in wrestling. Like, everything changed and Vince won. I mean, Vince for almost 20 years after 2001 was basically unopposed in wrestling, which is a crazy thing to think about, not just for wrestling, but for any industry. To have one person essentially in charge of the entirety of it. I mean, we have oligarchies, but we don't have many true monarchies in America when it comes to industry. And he was one, but Paul Heyman was part of it. You know, Paul came on as a commentator and a manager. He ends up managing Brock Lesnar and mentoring him, and Brock Lesnar becomes this huge sensation. Of course, now Brock Lesnar has been identified by major news outlets as possibly one of the people who was involved in the sex trafficking that was happening with Vince McMahon and the employee who's come forward, Janelle Grant. But, you know, at the time, Brock Lesnar became this huge name, and Paul Heyman was at his side for the whole time. So you have this real streak. You know, he has times when he's not appearing, times he's more appearing. I'm summarizing a lot here, but from 2001 onward, he's been a survivor. He's still around. He's still prominent. I mean, the thing is, to this day, after years of sometimes being manager, sometimes being a booker, sometimes having various roles, he's now just this really excellent manager of Roman Reigns and the Bloodline. Now, I don't know what's going to happen now that Roman Reigns isn't the champion, but I imagine Paul Heyman's going to be fine. You know, Paul Heyman gave that induction speech, and that was a real sign of confidence in that guy, you know, to use a term like guy. And I really think there's a long future for Paul Heyman, and I really, really want to chronicle his story in the sequel at some point. I mean, you have to. That's not a spoiler. That's just he's so intimately involved in the experience of being Vince McMahon and Vince McMahon's product and watching Vince McMahon's product from 2001. I mean, even starting like 1996, 97, you have Vince incorporating ideas and talent from Paul Heyman. And I feel like there's a real arc from that initial contact between the two to this speech last weekend, where Paul says he decided to get into wrestling as a fast talker because he saw an interview Vince did with superstar Billy Graham in the 70s when Vince was just a commentator. So Vince is part of the beginning of that, of Paul's wrestling career. And now Paul was a huge part of the end of Vince's wrestling career, essentially. I'm not saying Paul was the person who got him fired, but like he's intimately a part of the story. And then he's the one who gets brought up to give the funeral speech while Vince is still alive. So I really do think if you're going to pick in wrestling somebody who counts as like a guy, I couldn't think of somebody who fits that description more than Paul Heyman. He's a guy who's been around since forever. He's a guy who can talk himself out of any situation. He's a guy who has survived. And he's survived by doing this very interesting act that's not really an act, which he is this very Jewish American original. Like he's a real character. He's a macher, as my Yiddish great-grandparents would have put it. He makes things happen. And he's a schnorrer. He can go and talk his way into getting the free food at a buffet in an event he wasn't invited to. It's a real type, and it's fascinating. He's a fascinating guy. So I would nominate him for guyship or guyhood.
My first thought is going back to you bringing up Commedia dell'arte, because what it feels like you've described with Paul Heyman is him recognizing very early on, because of his heritage, there existed an archetype in that entertainment industry that he could just slot into perfectly.
Yep.
And he's just been fine doing that. And then after nuclear war, there will be cockroaches in Paul Heyman.
That's a good line. You're absolutely right. You can't stomp him. He's too smart. He's too fast. And he, like Vince, has figured out how to have a reputation as a son of a bitch in order to allow himself to survive and be a son of a bitch. Once you have that reputation and that's what people are expecting from you, then you can get away with a lot. This was the thing I kept saying about Vince, was like, he created this persona for himself that was virtue proof. You couldn't like fire your virtue gun at him. There was too much vice there. There was too much admitted vice as an armor. Paul doesn't portray himself quite as much of a sleazebag as Vince portrayed himself being, but there is that like, I'm an evil guy on television, so therefore you're going to be uncertain about what I'm going to do. And if I do something nice, you go, oh, he was only playing that evil character on television. And if I do something evil, you'll go, well, I guess that's what I expected of him. And either way, he gets what he wants.
It is interesting how he now, I think within the past 5 to 10 years, you could say, occupies like an anti-hero stance within wrestling fandom at large, where it's almost a hypocrisy too, where I think what he's capitalizing on and why he's so loved is he's seen as like the last vestige of that ECW era, the last vestige of
wrestling
the idea
before
that there
Vince.
could be. Exactly. Yeah. He is that last vestige, while also at the same time being a person who very literally sold out to Vince. Yeah. By the very definition of it did. He sold out his entire company to him. And I think that's probably the biggest compliment you can give him in terms of having the gift of gab, is that his action is to be literally a sellout, and yet he is hailed as the last vestige, the last piece of resistance that's like hung on.
That's how you do it. Many such stories. I'm a student of Jewish history. I could take my laptop up to my Judaica library in my office, but there are a lot of Jews who have survived very chaotic times by being a little loose with their alliances and their morals. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm not going to be an anti-Semite and be like, oh, those Jews doing that all the time. No, I'm saying if somebody's out to get you, or you're in an environment where you're a target, you kind of do what you have to do to survive. Now, I'm not justifying anything, but I can see how that happens. I can see how it happens in Paul Heyman, but I can see the roots of that in a larger sort of Jewish survival mentality, which anyone who is a child of a survivor will tell you that is a huge part of how you live your life. The people who came back from that did not come back the same, and you really had an intensity among those parents and grandparents that is hard to imagine if you didn't have one. And I really can't help but think that his mother being a survivor really influenced his approach to just staying alive and justifying what it takes to do in order to survive.
Xavier, I'm curious, with you having the least amount of like Paul Heyman background info coming into this, how do you feel now with the download?
So pardon my ignorance on this, if
Go
this
on.
is more normal. Do other managers / suits give themselves ring names as well? Because the fact that he gave himself the name Paul E. Dangerously, despite not being a wrestler and just managing them, is very, very funny to me.
Yeah, you get you Paul E. Dangerously was given to him by somebody else because they said you look like Johnny Dangerously, do something with that, and he was like, well, okay, I'm gonna call myself Paul E. Dangerously. But he's not the only one who's done something like that. I mean, Vince McMahon in the ring was Mr. McMahon. It was a copyrighted term. That was a persona and name that Vince McMahon came up with and enforced. It's not unique, but the people who know how to survive in wrestling know how to do that.
Okay, that's good to know, because obviously I definitely have the least wrestling knowledge out of anyone on this call.
That's fine. It's a weird event.
But I have found it very fascinating. I love builders. I love doing stuff with like the builders category, people who spend a lot of time behind the scenes making great things for everybody else. And you talked a lot about his ability as an orator. Your ability of that is extremely good. I was very much enraptured by this narrative. It's much better than what we normally do, so I felt a little bad about myself for a little bit there, but I really liked it. I thought it was fascinating.
Thank you. Yeah, I had to get good at that when I was in high school, so I can blabber pretty coherently.
So that's one guy archetype I think we've identified, Xavier, that you pointed out there, that he kind of like fits into that idea of like the builder category. I like to try and identify concepts that we've touched on before, and I do like the idea, one, of him being this major figure in a secondary league. There's always that idea of like, oh, he's the best guy at the second division of English football or something along those lines.
He was the third. I mean, ECW was the third promotion.
That's true, yeah.
WWF, WCW, and then a distant third because they had no money and they were too extreme to really be on mainstream television. ECW, which makes it a classic guy situation where it's like, oh, that guy. Yeah, right. He wasn't Vince McMahon, but he was somebody.
And on that same note of like recognition, we've talked before about guy recognize guy. There is something where like when others can point that out, we kind of go by the opinions of those in the industry that get it. But I think that can also turn the other way, because something you talked about is his talent at identifying talent. The fact that talent got poached by ECW, the fact that he was able to go out and pick out other guys. If one is able to recognize guy and guy recognizes guy, then, by transitive property, we would assume that it does go the other way.
I love it.
I also just love that, like, hey, we're in the middle of the 90s. I need to figure this out. Just add an extreme in there. We got it. Like,
that was how
you did it. He was doing guy, but that's how you do it.
That was the zeitgeist, and Vince was not as close to the zeitgeist when that was starting. I mean, Paul and Eric Bischoff too were ahead of the game. They were paying closer attention to the kind of mind bending and an extremity that the audience wanted. But when Vince finally caught up, he really caught up.
I have one more question that deviates a little bit from Heyman, but
go on.
It is something that I've thought about with him being presented as a survivor and with us being here in the wake of what seemed to be like some pretty final moments for Vince McMahon, at least in terms of the industry. Like, he has also survived for quite some time, but it looks like that's largely done. They both make a character out of being commissioners, and that's largely heel. And like in the rest of the sport, the owners and the commissioners are also often seen as heels. Like, I don't know how much you know about baseball. The commissioner of baseball, Rob Manfred, seems to actively hate the sport of baseball. And we all
I have
kind
not
of
been paying
hate the sport.
attention, but I believe you.
Yeah, he doesn't seem to like the sport, and that seems to be the case for a lot of them. I mean, they're you know, the owner of the Oakland Athletics. That is something that might have bled through just.
I'm a journalist. Every media organization practically is owned by somebody who hates journalists right now. So please, I understand.
Well, the point I'm getting at is
yes,
Vince McMahon is the one example I can think of someone getting forced out. And I guess the question is that, do you think because he is a uniquely horrid person, for lack of like a more artful phrase, or do you think that there ever will be some kind of reckoning that he can represent against these forces that own us? Or is it going to be like best case scenario, some of the worst ones do, but most like Paul Heyman just continue to hang on?
I don't know. I mean, wrestling, we're at a pivot point in wrestling where you could start to see bean counters having more power than mobsters, basically. I mean, wrestling has been run like a gangster enterprise for a century and a half. And with the end of the Vince McMahon era, and more importantly, even before that, the purchase of WWE by Endeavor, by Ari Emanuel's holding company, when that happened, that was the real turning point, because from then on, the people in charge of the main flagship of professional wrestling in this hemisphere, those people in charge are just corporate bean counters. You think Ari Emanuel has love of the business? You know, do you think the people, you know, his accountant cares that Paul Levesque has devoted everything to this business? No. If Triple H gets in trouble during the federal probe that is happening on Vince McMahon right now, then I can't imagine Paul Levesque will be long for this world as a C-suite executive. Like, the people in charge now don't care about whether these guys paid their dues. They don't care about whether they've respected the business and kept their mouth shut when they needed to. None of that matters. All that matters to the bean counters is we need to get content out there. We have a $5 billion Netflix deal. Let's get this stuff juiced. And if people are angry about the product, we need to have a scapegoat. So it's a very thin reed to stand on right now if you are an old school gangster wrestler type, because those people just aren't in charge anymore. The corporate suits are. So that could go either way. It could be that the corporate suits just go, hey, these gangster types, let's just invest in them. Who cares? Or it could be that there's enough public outrage or criminal investigation on some matter or aspect that they change course. I mean, as you said earlier, we're in this new territory where, unlike in the Vince McMahon era, they do change course based on public opinion. And that should be something that keeps Paul Levesque up at nights, is all I'm saying, is the idea that now we're listening to the public. Oh, well, if the public turns on Paul Levesque, then he's really got a problem. But as of now, they haven't.
Well, that brings to light, I think, my very favorite kind of nugget that you picked out with all of the Paul Heyman stuff, which was his skill setting up ECW as a place where it was a fantasy, and the thing you were most excited about was to see reality break in. And there is an element now of that. But I love that, and I think that sealed up what, for me, is going to be a yes vote for Paul Heyman. I don't know if the two of you have anything to say.
Beautiful.
Or casting anymore.
Yeah, I don't want to put my chickens into before they hatch. I don't know how that phrase goes. But what do you guys think?
No, I mean, I wouldn't describe myself as a huge wrestling fan. I have watched wrestling most of my life. At certain times, I've come to it more than I have before. And Paul Heyman is a through line through almost all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I look back to like the last moment that I would say I was all in on wrestling. And like I was at WrestleMania on Saturday. It was a lot of fun. I'm following wrestling now. I'm getting more familiar with it.
A lot of people are getting back into it. So yeah.
Right. It's a good time too. But like the last storyline that I was all the way in on was CM Punk's contract is about to run out.
Yeah.
He has this championship match with John Cena on the last day of his match. And the speech that he gives.
Yeah.
Exactly. In Chicago. And the speech that kicked off that whole kind of storyline was
Pipe
comes into the
bomb,
ring.
yeah.
Yup, beats the shit out of John Cena. And for just 15 to 20 minutes, just says everything that every fan of wrestling has ever wanted to say or wanted to hear somebody say about Vince McMahon and WWE. Literally saying, Vince, we will be better off when you are dead, until the point that his mic's cut off. And it's that teetering on the line of, okay, they told him to go cut a promo. I feel like he's saying some things he's not supposed to say now. Oh shit, they just cut his mic. Did they actually just cut his mic?
Yep.
Am I getting worked?
Magic. That's the magic.
That's the magic. I mean, and Paul Heyman cooks that magic juice better than anybody, I think.
According to CM Punk, that was really, it was the perfect neo kayfabe moment in that it was both work and shoot. Vince, according to CM Punk, told CM Punk, just go out there and shoot on me. Say everything you've been thinking and been afraid to say to me and say on television. And Punk was like, okay, I guess. And he went and did it, and Vince loved it. But that was the point. Right. It was an approved transgression.
And
it was impossible to know. It was like impossible to tell at the time. You're watching it live, you'd never know.
And the two most iconic lines are, the company will be better off when Vince is dead, and I'm a Paul Heyman guy.
Yes.
That line sticks out from it. And like now that type of verbiage, I'm an X guy, is now part of the wrestling nomenclature. And the first one is, I'm a Paul Heyman guy. So to me,
they have t-shirts that say it.
Exactly. So to me, the proof is right there. If people can be Paul Heyman guys, then Paul Heyman has to be a guy himself.
I already said I enjoyed the presentation and the narrative, and I don't have anything else interesting to say. So Diaz, I think you can just do the honors. I think this is unanimous.
It's absolutely unanimous. The story of wrestling is a story of survival. It's carny culture. It's finding the undesirables and making them desirable. That's what we always go for. And here we have this person who does not have a wrestler's build, really has no business being in a wrestling ring. And yet, when Paul Heyman is in a wrestling ring, there's nobody who can command the crowd like he does. He works the crowd like no other. He is, for better or for worse, time will eventually tell, one of the biggest influences in the history of professional wrestling. Yep. And therefore, he must be one of the biggest guys. So welcome into the Hall of Guy, Paul Heyman.
Wow. This feels momentous.
It is the most important hall that Paul Heyman was inducted into in the past 7 days.
Yeah, exactly.
Number one.
You'll get him on the next episode now, you know.
Wow. Yeah, he's in his post-Mania press tour. I'm sure he'll be jumping on.
Absolutely, he'd love to. Well, is that it? Have I done my job?
You have done your duty for Paul Heyman and bringing him in. We are delighted to have him. And we have been delighted to have you on to broaden the scope of the hall. Again, this is something that while the three of us have varying levels of interest in it, it's not been welcomed in here too much before. So we appreciate, again, that sort of broadening the scope. Now, if Josie, say people wanted to broaden the scope of their own world to include the thoughts that you have outside of this, what are some perhaps readings they could do or places they could look to find that information?
The paperback of Ringmaster, my biography of Vince McMahon, comes out on Tuesday, April 16th.
So that was approximately 6 days ago. This will be 4/22.
Great, 4/22. So you don't. If you're listening to this, it's too late to come to the release show. I hope you did come to the release show because there was a lot of queer wrestling. At least I assume there will have been queer wrestling. The event has not yet happened as of when I'm recording it. But I am putting out my paperback, and it's deluxe. Even if you've read the hardcover, there's plenty in here that you've never seen before. There are no fewer than 3 appendix sections and some new information and an afterword, all kinds of stuff. So the paperback is what I'm shilling the most right now. And if you go to my website, you can find it prominently displayed right there. Actually, you can go to the book's website first. That is ringmasterthebook.com. The site for me is Josie, Josie, .zone, like the Twilight Zone, Zone. Josie.zone is my website. So if you want to find more about me or the book, please visit one of those 2 URLs.
We want to thank you one more time for visiting us, but of course we also want to thank producer Craig and the coders behind him for helping record, and our musical director Don Ham for that lovely theme music at the beginning. Most of all, though, we do want to thank you, dear listener, for tuning in again. If you are interested in visiting our quote-unquote website, you can, as always, go to bit.ly/remember that guy, all one word, all lowercase. We will continue to have Guys of the Day. Probably not the week that this is going up, because I'm in Uganda right now. But when I get back, we'll have more Guys of the Day. And we will still have some programming next week. Don't worry, that will not keep us from getting another excellent interstitial episode to you next Monday. Until then, anything else from you guys on the way out?
Lindsay Harding being interviewed by Charlotte for their head coaching job. I told you, she is going to be the first female head coach in the NBA.
We agreed with you.
I know, but I have to give an
We're
update
all
to
in
listeners.
agreement. Glad
I'll show all of you. Anyway.
Xavier, I am glad that you get to be right. All I get to have been this whole time is one of your hosts, James.
And I've been the very right special guest, Xavier.
I've been the instigator, Josie Riesman.
Great to have you, Josie. I've been Diaz, and as Ric Flair once said, if you want to be the guy, you gotta beat the guy.
You could also just the thought that came to my mind was, my first book was about Stan Lee, and he once sponsored this comic at Marvel that he then wanted to distance himself from. So instead of calling himself the publisher of the comic, he was listed as Instigator, which I've always liked as a good word. So if you want to call me the Instigator, I'm fine with that.